Marcus Hall had always thought the end of the world, if it ever came, would at least have the courtesy to give some warning. A crack in the sky, a siren, maybe a blinding flash of light. Instead, it began with an ordinary hum beneath his feet. A low, vibrating noise that wasn't sound so much as sensation. He had been working on a radio tower in the middle of the Nevada desert when it happened. The hum rose, tickling the bones of his skull, and when he looked up, the world collapsed inward, a whirlpool of sky and sand swallowing itself. Then, nothing. Dr. Alyssa Vega's last memory of Earth was the sterile smell of her laboratory. She'd been examining blood samples under her microscope when the air itself seemed to ripple. The temperature plummeted. There was no time to react before everything folded into blackness. The others, Leah Nguyen, Noah Patel, and Benjamin Rhodes, had their own stories. But they awoke the same way. On the floor of an alien corridor, their faces pressed against a cold, ridged surface that pulsed faintly beneath their skin. The light around them was dim, greenish, and wrong. Shadows stretched too long, curling unnaturally at the edges of the room. The walls shimmered with a strange organic texture, like a cross between flesh and stone. The air was thick, almost wet, carrying a faint metallic tang. Alyssa sat up first, wincing as a dull ache pounded behind her eyes. She took a long, slow breath, trying to steady her nerves. In the dim glow, she saw the others stirring. Marcus groaned and rubbed his temples, his shirt caked in dust from the fall. Where the hell? Leah, the youngest of the group, scrambled to her feet, her face pale. What is this place? A ship? Noah, a wiry college student with glasses askew on his nose, muttered, "No way. This is a nightmare. It's gotta be." Benjamin, rugged and broad-shouldered, didn't say a word at first. He just stared at the pulsating walls, his jaw tightening. After a long pause, he finally muttered, "Feels alive." Alyssa knelt near one of the walls, brushing her fingertips against its ridges. The surface was warm and faintly pliant. Her instincts told her this wasn't metal, it was tissue. Her stomach turned. Marcus exhaled sharply. This can't be real." "It's real," Alyssa said, her voice steadier than she felt. She pushed herself to her feet and glanced down the long, curved hallway. There was no door behind them, no obvious entrance or exit, just a passageway that disappeared into darkness. Benjamin finally broke his silence. "We need to move." "Move where?" Leah asked, hugging herself. "We don't even know where we are." "Exactly why we need to move," Benjamin replied, his eyes hard. "Sitting here isn't going to get us answers." Alyssa nodded. "He's right. We need to understand our surroundings." Noah let out a weak laugh, though it was more fear than humor. "Surroundings? We're on some kind of alien ship. God, I sound insane just saying it." Leah shivered but forced herself to take a breath. "Okay, fine, we move, but stay together. No splitting up." The group exchanged wary glances, but fell into an uneasy agreement. They walked forward, their footsteps muffled by the strange, porous floor. The deeper they went, the more the ship seemed to breathe around them. Veins of bioluminescent fluid pulsed along the walls in slow, rhythmic waves. The air felt heavier the farther they went, like walking through a thick fog that clung to their skin. They passed chambers filled with strange growths, spherical sacs suspended from the ceiling, swaying slightly as though cradled by some invisible breeze. The sacs' surfaces were translucent, and within, faint shapes shifted, twitching in their embryonic slumber. Leah swallowed hard. Those things, are they alive? Alyssa leaned in, squinting. The shape inside was vaguely humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Its torso too long, its limbs jointed in places that defied anatomy. She quickly stepped back. Let's keep moving. Marcus hesitated near one of the walls. Thin tendrils like blood-red vines wove through the organic surface. He reached out, curious despite himself, and brushed the tip of his finger against one. The tendril reacted instantly. It curled around his finger like a snake and constricted. Marcus yelped and yanked his hand away, but the tendril retracted just as fast, sinking back into the wall with a wet slurp. Alyssa grabbed his wrist. "Let me see." "It's fine," Marcus muttered, though his face was pale. A thin line of blood beaded across his finger. Benjamin's voice was low and tense. "Don't touch anything else." "Agreed," Alyssa said, glancing around. The entire ship suddenly felt like a trap waiting to spring. Noah pointed toward the end of the corridor. "There's something up ahead." The group crept forward, cautious now. At the end of the hall, the passage opened into a wide, domed chamber. At the center of the room was a strange platform, surrounded by strange alien glyphs that pulsed faintly. Above it, a spherical device, almost like a giant fleshy eye, hovered, its surface glistening. "What is that?" Leah whispered. Alyssa approached slowly, heart pounding in her chest. She reached out toward the glyphs, and the sphere reacted. It opened, splitting down the middle with a wet, peeling sound, revealing a dark, abyssal core. The walls trembled. A deep, reverberating hum filled the room. The same hum they'd heard before everything went dark. The floor beneath them shuddered violently. Marcus stumbled back, eyes wide. "What did you do?" "I didn't," Alyssa started, but the ship's hum deepened, drowning her out. The air itself seemed to distort, bending and warping. The organic walls pulsed faster now, as if the entire structure had awakened. A series of chittering clicks echoed through the chamber, growing louder, closer. Then came the sound of something wet, slithering, something alive. A dark shape moved at the far end of the chamber, long, sinuous, and wrong. A cold, instinctual dread gripped the humans as they realized they weren't alone. Leah's breath hitched. "We need to run." The shape lunged forward, fast, faster than any human could react. The group scattered, their terror boiling over. The walls pulsed in time with the creature's movement, like the heartbeat of some immense, slumbering beast. Alyssa barely dodged the thing's strike as its tendrils lashed out, missing her by inches. She hit the floor hard, gasping for air, the thick scent of blood and alien musk filling her nose. From somewhere behind her, Noah screamed. The silence after the attack was worse than the noise. It was a silence laced with expectation, a pregnant pause in which fear could fester and grow. They had escaped the creature, barely, but the victory tasted like ash. Alyssa's heartbeat still thudded in her ears as she leaned against the trembling wall, struggling to catch her breath. The alien corridors stretched out before them like the winding arteries of some enormous beast. She could feel it shifting beneath her feet, alive, aware. "Is everyone here?" she gasped. Noah stumbled into view, clutching his side. His face was pale beneath the blood smeared on his cheek. I think so." Benjamin emerged next, helping a shaken Leah who was limping but alive. Marcus followed last, his face a mask of pain as he cradled his arm against his chest. Alyssa stepped toward him. "Let me see that." Marcus hesitated, but then he slowly unwrapped his hand. His sleeve was torn, and beneath it, his forearm was slick with blood. A deep gash ran across his skin, but something about the wound wasn't right. The edges of the cut were discolored, a dark, rust-colored hue spreading out like veins under the skin. The flesh around it had begun to harden into something unnatural. Leah's breath caught. "Oh my God!" Alyssa forced herself to stay calm, though dread gnawed at the edges of her composure. "We'll clean it. It could just be contamination from the ship." But even as she said it, she knew the truth was worse. Marcus met her eyes and gave a weak, humorless laugh. "Contamination? Is that what we're calling it now?" Benjamin's jaw clenched. "We don't know what it is yet." "We do," Noah whispered, his voice cracking. This place is changing us, just like it changed those things we saw." Alyssa shot him a warning look, but the damage was done. Leah's breathing quickened and her hands trembled as she wrapped her arms around herself. No, I don't want to end up like them." Her voice broke. "I can't. Leah." Alyssa's voice was firm but gentle. She stepped closer. "We're not going to let that happen. We just need to stay calm and keep moving. There has to be a way off this ship." Leah nodded shakily, but her eyes were glassy with terror. "Where do we even go?" Marcus muttered. "Every corridor leads us in circles." Benjamin took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "We keep moving forward. Sitting here arguing won't help." Marcus glared at him. "Oh, great plan. Let's wander around and hope the nightmare fuel doesn't find us again." Benjamin's face darkened. "You have a better idea." Before Marcus could reply, Noah spoke, his voice distant. "I found something." They turned to see him holding a small, rectangular device, roughly the size of a journal, its surface made of an unfamiliar metallic material. Its edges pulsed with faint lines of light. "Where did you get that?" Alyssa asked. "It was in the corner of the last chamber, near the bodies." Noah's hands trembled as he flipped it open. The device projected a soft, holographic glow. Alien glyphs shimmered in the air before shifting into something legible. Earth languages. English, Spanish, Mandarin. It was as though the ship itself was translating the text for them. Benjamin stepped closer, frowning. "What does it say?" Noah squinted at the words, his lips moving silently before he read aloud. "We were chosen by the Harmonizer. Our bodies were unworthy, our minds too fragile. It will break us to reshape us. It will sing its new shape into our bones. There is no escape, only assimilation." A cold shudder ran through the group. Leah backed away, shaking her head. No, this can't be real. Marcus's expression twisted. It's just some alien journal. Doesn't mean it's true. Alyssa's stomach churned as the reality of their situation began to crystallize. She thought of the fleshy sacks they had passed, the twisted remnants of former beings fused into the walls. Each one had once been alive, brought here under the same false prophecy. The harmonizer didn't just kill, it reformed, rebuilt its prey, turning them into grotesque extensions of itself. It explains the changes, Alyssa muttered. It's infecting us, like a parasite, but it's rewriting our biology. Marcus's face paled even more. Are you saying I'm becoming one of those things? We're not going to let it get that far, Alyssa said quickly, though she wasn't sure how. If we can figure out what triggers the process, we might be able to stop it. Benjamin's voice was low, filled with grim certainty. Or we might have to stop it another way. The air grew thick with the unspoken implication. Leah's eyes widened. You're not saying we'd kill each other? Benjamin didn't answer. Alyssa stepped between them, holding up her hands. No one is dying. Not unless we've exhausted every option. She shot Benjamin a warning glance. No one. An uneasy silence settled over the group. Then, from somewhere deep within the ship, a wet, skittering sound echoed through the corridors, soft at first, but growing louder, closer. Noah swallowed hard. It's here. Benjamin moved to the front, taking a defensive stance. We have to move, now. Alyssa nodded. Find somewhere we can defend ourselves. The group broke into a run, their footsteps pounding against the organic floor. The ship responded, its walls quivering as if in anticipation. The air thickened with a sickly green mist that clung to their lungs. The chittering sound followed them, relentless. They reached a wide chamber and stopped, gasping for air. There were no other exits. They were trapped. No way out, Marcus whispered. The sound of something heavy slithering into the chamber sent a wave of terror through them. The creature emerged from the shadows, long and sinewy, its pale, eyeless face framed by sharp ridges of exposed muscle. Its mouth was a mass of twitching mandibles. Worse, the creature's torso was vaguely humanoid, its shape disturbingly familiar, as though it had once resembled something like them. Leah screamed. The creature lunged, tendrils snapping toward them. Benjamin tackled Leah out of the way as the appendage struck the ground where she'd been standing. The floor hissed and bubbled beneath its touch. Marcus grabbed a length of piping that had fallen loose from the wall and swung wildly at the creature. The makeshift weapon connected with a wet crunch, but the creature didn't flinch. It seized Marcus by the arm, the infected one. Marcus let out a strangled cry as the tendrils dug into his flesh. The hardened scales along his arm cracked open, and his veins bulged unnaturally. His skin twisted, turning black and glossy as the infection spread further. No, Alyssa screamed. She grabbed another piece of debris and slammed it into the creature's side with all her strength. The impact was enough to make it release Marcus, who collapsed to the floor, writhing in pain. Benjamin and Noah dragged Marcus back as Alyssa shouted, "We have to go, now!" The creature reared back, screeching as the group scrambled toward the far side of the chamber. A narrow crevice led to another passage, a chance at escape. They dove into the passage just as the creature lunged again, its claws raking the walls. As they ran, Marcus's ragged breaths grew weaker. His skin was rapidly mutating, shifting between flesh and something alien. Leah's eyes filled with tears. "We can't leave him like this." Alyssa's heart twisted. "We'll find a way to stop it. We have to." But even as they fled deeper into the ship, she couldn't shake the terrible truth. The Harmonizer had chosen them for a reason, and now it was watching their every move. The passage seemed to stretch forever. The air grew warmer with every step, thick and suffocating like a fever dream. The walls pulsated in slow, wet ripples, oozing faint, bioluminescent liquid that glowed an eerie green. The deeper they went, the more the organic structures around them began to shift, slimy tendrils hanging like curtains, translucent membranes shivering with faint movements beneath their surface. The ship was funneling them, herding them towards something. Marcus was growing weaker. His breaths were shallow, his skin slick with a sickly sheen of sweat. The infection had spread up his shoulder, blackened tendrils creeping toward his neck. His arm was no longer human. It had hardened into a grotesque limb with chitinous plating and twitching, vestigial claws. Alyssa and Noah supported him as they moved, his legs dragging behind. Leah trailed close behind, eyes wide and darting, as though expecting the walls themselves to close in at any moment. Benjamin was at the front, his jaw set in grim determination. "We're getting close to something," Benjamin muttered. "You feel that?" Alyssa nodded. The air had changed. It wasn't just warmer. There was a pressure, a low hum that resonated in their bones like the sound of a massive beating heart. The ship wasn't just alive, it was awake. The tunnel widened into an enormous chamber, and they stopped in their tracks. The hive, the ceiling stretched high above, crisscrossed with organic bridges of veined tissue. Towering columns of flesh rose from the floor, each one pulsing with faint light. Suspended between them were hundreds, maybe thousands, of embryonic sacs. They hung in clusters like grotesque fruit, their surfaces stretched thin over indistinct shapes. Some sacs were dark and motionless, their contents lifeless. Others twitched and pulsed, their occupants shifting as though in restless sleep. Leah covered her mouth with a trembling hand. Oh my God. One of the sacs nearest them was more translucent than the others. Inside, a nearly formed creature floated in the viscous fluid. It was vaguely humanoid but elongated, its limbs stretched unnaturally long. Its skull was malformed, ridged with thick bone plates. Its mouth opened and closed in slow, twitching spasms, as though tasting the fluid around it. Its eyes, still partially human, rolled beneath the thin membrane of its lids. Noah stumbled back, bile rising in his throat. Those were people. Alyssa's eyes flicked over the rows of sacs, horror tightening her chest. She knew, deep down, that some of these creatures had once stood where they were now, victims of the Harmonizer's hunger. The prophecy had lied to all of them. They weren't saviors. They were fodder. "It's incubating them," she whispered. This is how it reproduces." Benjamin clenched his fists. "We have to destroy it." Alyssa blinked at him. "Destroy it?" "Benjamin, look around you. This isn't some machine we can break. It's biological. It's the ship itself. Noah's voice was faint, distant. There has to be a control core, something keeping all of this alive. He pointed toward the far end of the chamber where an enormous structure loomed, a bulbous mass of tissue with thick, branching veins extending outward like a web. It pulsed in time with the hum that filled the air. "That's it," Alyssa whispered. "The heart." Marcus let out a low, rasping sound. His head lolled back, eyes glazed. His skin had grown paler, almost translucent. The veins under his skin throbbed black. His mouth moved, forming words that weren't his own. "It sees you." The voice wasn't Marcus's. It was low, layered, as though a chorus of unseen mouths spoke through him. The sound cut through the chamber like a blade of ice. Leah whimpered. "No. Marcus, don't." Marcus's body spasmed violently. His back arched, and his infected arm convulsed, the claws twitching like the legs of an insect. Alyssa and Noah tried to hold him, but he thrashed with inhuman strength. With a sudden jerk, he broke free and collapsed to the ground. A sickening crack echoed through the chamber as Marcus's spine twisted unnaturally. His limbs stretched, joints snapping apart and reforming. His mouth tore open wider than it should have been, his teeth elongating into jagged, needle-like shards. The infection had consumed him. Leah screamed. "No! Marcus!" No, the thing that had once been Marcus lifted itself up on all fours, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. Its eyes had been replaced by dark, empty sockets. The creature let out a keening wail that resonated through the hive. Above them, the embryonic sacs twitched in response. Benjamin didn't hesitate. He grabbed a jagged piece of metal from the floor and charged. The creature lunged to meet him, its claws slicing through the air. The two collided with a sickening crunch, tumbling across the floor. Benjamin drove the metal shard into the creature's side, black ichor spraying across his arms. Alyssa grabbed Leah and Noah. "We need to get to the core, now!" "But Benjamin," Leah cried. "He knows what he's doing," Alyssa snapped, dragging her forward. They sprinted toward the pulsating heart at the far end of the chamber. The ground shuddered beneath their feet, and the sacs overhead began to split open. Slimy, half-formed creatures tumbled from their cocoons, writhing and twitching as they awakened. The heart pulsed faster, its surface swelling and contracting in waves. Thin tendrils reached out from it, wriggling toward the approaching humans like nerves seeking contact. Noah pulled a small, cylindrical device from his pocket, the power core he'd salvaged from the ship's control panel earlier. It pulsed faintly in his hand, a miniature reactor. "We can overload it," he panted. "If I can get it inside the heart, it'll cause a chain reaction." Alyssa nodded. "Do it." Noah hesitated for half a second, then ran forward, ducking beneath the grasping tendrils. The core in his hand flared to life, glowing brighter with each step. The heart shuddered as though sensing its own destruction. The tendrils lashed out wildly, one of them catching Noah across the side and sending him sprawling. "Noah!" Alyssa screamed. She rushed forward, dodging another tendril, and grabbed the core from where it had fallen. She locked eyes with Noah, his face twisted with pain, and in that moment, no words were needed. He nodded once. Alyssa turned and hurled the core straight into the center of the heart. It sank into the pulsing mass with a wet squelch. The hum in the air changed, rising in pitch, becoming a shrill, deafening scream. The heart convulsed, its veins blackening. The sacks above them began to rupture, spilling their contents in a flood of gore. The chamber shook violently as the hive began to collapse. Alyssa grabbed Noah and pulled him to his feet. "Run!" They sprinted back toward the tunnel, the floor cracking and splitting beneath their feet. Behind them, the heart burst apart in a spray of black fluid, releasing a shock wave that tore through the chamber. Benjamin was still locked in combat with the creature that had once been Marcus. He looked up as the walls began to cave in, his eyes meeting Alyssa's for a brief, heartbreaking moment. Then the hive collapsed completely, and Benjamin was swallowed by the darkness. The collapse of the hive felt like the end of the universe. The sound was deafening, flesh and bone tearing apart, membranes splitting open, and the wet, reverberating crack of the ship's biological core disintegrating. The walls rippled and ruptured like organs giving out, spilling viscous fluid into every passage. The entire structure heaved and twisted as though in death throes. Alyssa couldn't feel her legs anymore. She was running on pure instinct. Her grip tightened around Noah's arm as they stumbled through the corridor. The floor pitched beneath them, a grotesque wave of organic tissue writhing as it died. "Faster!" Alyssa shouted, though her voice was barely audible over the ship's agonized wails. The sound wasn't mechanical. It was alive, screaming. The harmonizer was dying, but it wasn't going quietly. Noah's face was pale, his body weak from blood loss. He clutched his ribs with one hand, but he nodded, forcing himself to keep moving. The tunnel ahead curved toward the evacuation chamber, a small alcove where they had seen the remnants of an escape pod before. It was their last chance. Behind them, the chamber of horrors they'd fled collapsed in a tidal wave of muscle and bone. The hive's creatures, the embryonic horrors that hadn't yet fully formed, writhed as they were consumed by the implosion, limbs twitching before they were crushed beneath the collapsing walls. But Alyssa wasn't thinking about them. She wasn't even thinking about herself. She was thinking about Benjamin. His face flashed in her mind, the fierce determination as he faced down the twisted thing that Marcus had become. The last look he'd given her, a silent farewell. He had known he wouldn't make it out. He'd known, and he'd still fought to give them a chance. Her chest ached, but she shoved the grief down. There would be time to mourn later, if they survived. The corridor narrowed as they reached the escape pod bay. The pod itself was strange, like a metallic cocoon grown from the ship's sinews. Its surface was smooth, dark, and slightly translucent, glowing faintly from within. A panel of glyphs shimmered on its side, pulsing in rhythmic patterns. Noah collapsed against the pod, gasping for breath. His entire left side was slick with blood. Alyssa grabbed him by the shoulders. "We're almost there. Come on, we have to..." A rumbling roar echoed through the corridor, followed by a sickening scrape. Alyssa froze. Slowly she turned. The thing that had been Marcus was still alive. Its body was grotesquely misshapen, limbs stretched and broken, ribs protruding like jagged spears. Black ichor oozed from gaping wounds, but it crawled forward, dragging itself along the floor with relentless determination. The infection had claimed every last part of him, warping him into a nightmare. His eyeless sockets glowed faintly with an unnatural greenish light. A low, guttural sound escaped its twisted mouth, a sound that almost impossibly resembled a word. Alyssa. Her breath caught in her throat. The thing was barely recognizable, but for the briefest of moments, something in its voice sounded familiar, human. Noah's grip tightened on her arm. "It's not him," he whispered, trembling. "It's not him anymore." Alyssa knew that, but it didn't make it any easier. The creature let out a chittering screech and lunged. Its speed was horrifying, even with its broken body. Alyssa shoved Noah into the pod and slammed her hand against the glyphs. The cocoon-like door began to close, its edges sealing with a wet, organic hiss. The creature slammed into the pod's side just as the door sealed shut. The impact reverberated through the small space, making Alyssa stumble. She watched through the translucent wall as it clawed at the surface, its jagged fingers scraping deep gashes into the material. Its ruined face pressed against the surface, mandibles clicking in frustration. Noah was shaking, his face pale with exhaustion. "We have to launch it, now." Alyssa hesitated. She could feel the harmonizer's death throes resonating through the pod. The entire ship was tearing itself apart, but the creature wasn't giving up. It had become something beyond survival, an extension of the hive's final, desperate instinct. Her fingers hovered over the launch panel. All she had to do was activate it, and the pod would disengage, launching them into the void. But something gnawed at her, an impossible whisper of doubt. What if Marcus was still in there, somewhere buried beneath the infection? "Don't think about it," she told herself. "You can't save him." She pressed the glyph. The pod shuddered as it released from the ship's tendrils. There was a lurch, and then they were free, propelled into the black void of space. The ship's massive form crumbled behind them, collapsing inward like a dying star. Its organic shell peeled away, revealing a swirling mass of bone-white tissue and jagged spines. The heart of the harmonizer imploded in a flash of green light, sending shockwaves rippling across the void. Alyssa stared through the viewport, watching as the nightmare finally died. The creature that had been Marcus was gone, consumed in the implosion. There was no body, no remains, just emptiness. She slumped against the pod's wall, her strength finally giving out. Her hands trembled as the adrenaline drained away, leaving only raw, aching grief. Benjamin was gone. Marcus was gone. Leah. They had lost so much. Noah's voice was weak, but steady. "We did it." Alyssa nodded, though the word felt hollow. "Yeah, we did." The pod's controls flickered, displaying a map of the surrounding void. They were drifting. The ship was gone, but they were alone now, adrift in the endless black. Noah shifted, wincing. We'll find someone, a signal. There's got to be something out here, right?" Alyssa forced herself to smile for his sake. "Yeah, there has to be." But her gaze drifted to her hand, and her heart froze. There, just beneath her palm, was a faint, dark patch of skin. It was small, barely the size of a coin, but the veins beneath it pulsed faintly, black and webbed. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She didn't say anything. The pod drifted onward, a fragile cocoon in the infinite darkness of space. The galaxy had called for heroes, and humanity had answered, but the cost of survival was steep. Alyssa closed her eyes as the silence of the void wrapped around them. She wasn't sure if they had truly won, and deep within her something stirred. The harmonizer had died, but it had not been defeated.